everyone, and welcome to today's live discussion on the topic of future studies. I'm Bowen Feng, the community builder here at Systems Innovation, and I'm glad to be joined by two fantastic speakers, Zanne and Janine, who I'll introduce very shortly. So, as we all know, change is an inevitable part of life. I mean, just to take the current situation, we are all simultaneously taking part in this virtual event from living spaces all over the world, live streamed onto YouTube. And we all, of course, expect this to be super seamless and be achieved in just a few clicks. But the thing is, just a generation ago, of course, this would have sounded absurd. But now it's really become quite standard and something that a lot of us just take for granted, me certainly. And of course, when we think of the emergence of this technology, it has profound implications for society. And so given this rapid pace of change that we're witnessing, it's becoming more important than ever for us to develop the tools and techniques to better predict patterns and trends to respond to what's coming. And one growing field which addresses this need very specifically is that of future studies. And so this is the topic that our speakers will present on today. And it is a live discussion after all, so we'd love to open it up for audience questions at the end. So if you have any questions or anything you would like to bring forward to the speakers, please leave a comment in the YouTube chat, and we'll be monitoring them throughout, and we'll aim to pass it on at the end so that we can cover those. And so now to move on to introducing the guests. So first we have Zanne Horell, who is a futurist, facilitator, and strategic foresight practitioner, and is a director at Teach the Future in South Africa. Zanne has 16 years of management experience in finance and IT, and holds a postgraduate diploma in future studies. On top of this, Zanne is a research associate for the Institute for Futures Research and a member of the Association of Professional Futurists. Next, we have Janine Nell, who is also a director of the South African Hub for Teach the Future. She is a communication strategist and a research associate in the Institute for Futures Research at the University of Stellenbosch, as well as a workshop facilitator. Janine holds a master's in future studies at the University of Stellenbosch and is also a research associate for the Institute for Futures Research and a member of the Association of Professional Futurists and the World Futures Studies Federation. And the guests are also joined by fellow co-host Cobus van Rooyen, who is a partner at Systems Innovation and is also a member of the Association of Professional Futurists. And so with that, it's with a great pleasure that I now pass on to our speakers, Zanne and Janine. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bowen. I'm going to start sharing my screen now so that we can, so please tell me if the technology is doing what it's supposed to. There we go.
Seems to be doing what it's supposed to. I can see your screen now.
Excellent. So you might notice that we've changed the topic and we call it Futures for All. But I think your introduction actually matches what the topic says, because right now where we are, future studies, which is an academic discipline, is no longer reserved for academics. It's actually something that we all need to pay attention to. So and as you mentioned, Janine and I are both directors of Teach the Future South Africa. So a lot of what we are talking about today are the things that we also talk to students and learners about, because we in our heart of hearts believe that this is one of the skills that our children and the young people will need as they venture into the next part of the century. Over to you, Janine.
So thanks, Zanne, and thanks very much to Systems Innovations for the invite and the opportunity to talk to all of you today. And Zanne is correct when we talk about the Futures for All and the work that we do with students and school children around the world. If we move on, when we talk about strategic foresight, and it's a big word, and we don't use that with young people, of course, is that it's a discipline predominantly and a set of tools, methodologies where we investigate the future to see what the future might possibly hold. And And we do that so that we can be better prepared. It also allows us the opportunity to identify some scenarios that we might want to see happen in the future. And when we look at the field, obviously there are a number of areas within strategic foresight, or futures thinking, as we like to call it, which are really areas, especially trend forecasting or scanning or looking at the dots on the horizon and those sort of things. And they definitely are part of what we do, but these are for people who actually do foresight. These are people that practice it around the world. But for us, we like to think about futures thinking. And this is what we take to the learners and students in South Africa, to change a type of mindset, to think just about now, to think of the impacts of what we might do, and to think of the alternatives. It's very important for us that they understand that there are multiple futures available. There's not just one future. It will always change. And even if we identify 4 or 5 futures, there's a good chance that none of them will come true and will actually happen as we envision them. The future is generally a mixture of all of that. And it's important to us that we teach the young people as well to say, well, what if this happens? Or what about if this aspect of it changes? So it's just another way of considering the world and to understand and make sense of it.
Thanks, Janine. So I'm going to take you back a little bit. I'm sure everyone has come through some form of education. And I would be very surprised if anyone had futures or futures thinking or foresight as part of their curriculum when they were at school, or even when they were at university. So what happens when we are at school? We actually are taught something about the future, but we are unfortunately taught quite a number of contradictory things about the future. So if those of you who've had science class, science teaches us all about a predictable future. In the world of science, the future is like a river or a road or a roller coaster, and there's one path that just keeps on going. So you formulate a hypothesis, you predict what's going to happen, and lo and behold, it either happens or it didn't. But it's a fairly linear, fairly structured, predictable situation. Another place where we are sort of taught about the future is in history class, because you can't really look at the future unless you understand history. But in terms of history, the future is just a sequence of unchanging causes and effects. It's a very inevitable future. So you often hear people say, oh, it's just more of the same, or history repeats itself. That's a phrase people commonly use. So in history class, we are taught about the inevitable future. Then there's also the anthropologists, the sociologists, the economists, the political scientists. They have a completely different perspective on the future. They talk about the contingent future. The future is a foggy road that is largely unknowable and unpredictable. We almost know too much. If you're an economist, the variables that you have to deal with is just unsurmountable. Anthropology, I mean, humans are so complex that we can't possibly try and imagine what the future would hold. I mean, even worse, the statistics class. In statistics, we are being taught that the future is completely uncertain. It's a roll of the dice, or it's a roulette wheel that just gets thrown at us. So after a good few years of education, we are all left terribly confused about the future. Is it predictable? Is it completely unpredictable? And we sort of try to make sense of this dichotomy. And then to make matters worse, we have our parents and teachers and preachers and mentors. And please, I say that this with the greatest level of respect, but if anyone ever tells one of my children or the children that we work with, if you can dream it, you can do it, I am going to have a heart attack, because honestly, there is no such thing as a chosen future. Yes, we can make plans, but we cannot have every single future we want. That is not true. You can have some of what you dream, but you can't have it all. So this is a very, very complicated space that the future holds in our minds.
So it's important to understand, I suppose, for all of us, but also especially for younger people, that the future is simultaneously predictable and unpredictable. It's in our control and also out of our control. We know that things can happen randomly or they can happen predictably. But what we do need to understand, and I think take some sort of comfort in, is the fact that we are not a victim where the future is going to happen to us. We have agency and we have power and we have beliefs and ways of being in the world where we can actually influence how that future will look. So we're not simply left to fate. So when we think of futures thinking or future studies as a field, we emphasize the fact that it's a tool, it's a discipline, it's something for people and individuals to use. They can make sense of the world. So a very big important aspect of futures thinking is change. And the change that happens around in the world. It's about change in general. It's about change that that happens to us and change we make happen. And for us, this is really important to teach, especially to younger people and quite frankly to all of us, is the fact that in a school system, a subject is taken, it's simplified in a way, and it's given to the children in digestible chunks so that they can understand how this happened. But the world isn't a simple place. The world is a very complex, interconnected, interrelated place where, and you in systems thinking understand that everything has an impact on something else. So we need to ensure that when we've reached the end of our education careers or time period, we understand that the world is not simple, and that change can happen in any aspect, in all aspects, and then how do we navigate around that? So when we talk about change, we talk about inbound change that happens to us, and these are the things that happen. This is, we generally have very little control over. It's literally sitting at a card table, and it's the hand you're dealt. In a poker game, you can't give them back and say, oh, I don't really like these. You've got to take what you've dealt. It's, the old saying is about you've made your bed, now lie in it. Well, it's happened to us. But the outbound change, that's the exciting bit about futures and thinking about change and new mindset. That's where we have the ability to make a change. We can influence where this goes. Obviously within limits, because it still needs to be possible. We can think about a lot of possibilities we would like. For many of you who might be watching the program years and years, which is set in the future, we have all sorts of things happening, devices, cell phones planted in the head, connectivity and wires in the hand. In the program, it's possible. I think right now it's not. So as long as it's possible, we can influence it to make it so. But change doesn't just happen the same. Change happens at different paces, and we get different rates of change. So you can have continuous change. And these are the things that happen generally over long periods. These are trends that might develop, and we can see how those things happen. It's like the size of computers. If we think back about the pictures we've seen about computers being this, computer rooms being the size of a house to a small size, a cell phone, that's a continuous long-term change. And usually those things remain intact. But then where things get interesting is when we talk about discontinuous change. This is when surprises happen. People generally don't like surprises because we're never prepared for them. Many people thought that COVID was a big surprise, even though we've been talking about new viruses and pandemics for quite a while. But these are the things that we can think about in advance and we can prepare for ourselves. For instance, if we know there's a big storm coming and we're expecting flooding, we're all expecting our homes to hold up. We prepare, we say the riverbanks are fairly good, it's never overflowed, it's fine. But what we should also ask is, but what if those riverbanks don't hold? What could possibly happen then? And let's prepare for that. It's a contingency we're going to look at because it's something we're not expecting. And if we are prepared for it, we can so better deal with it. It's also quote by, I think, Dwight Eisenhower, who said that plans are fairly useless, but planning is critical. So it's all in the planning. So change and disruption, of course, happen around us all the time. We have wars that happen. We have the COVID that happened. We have financial markets collapsing. We have, dare I say, even Trump as a president. It's a disruption. It's a surprise. It's not what we thought. We've landed on the moon, something we never thought might happen. And these disruptions don't just happen and go away. What they do is they have an impact on everything around them. If we think just on the impact of airlines because of 9/11, how that impacted the flight industry. If we think about the COVID pandemic, how that's impacted education systems, the health systems, the impact and the demand on pharmaceutical companies. If we think about social media and digital revolution that impacted every single industry. And thank goodness, because we're all sitting in our homes tonight and we can communicate and share information, which possibly wasn't possible 10 years ago. But it doesn't just impact industry. It then moves on and it impacts our lives. We've all spent an enormous amount of time with families cooped up in a small space. How has that affected us? We thought a little virus could lead to an increase in divorce rate because people are cooped up in homes together. The fact that everyone's watching television or watching series, but there's no new material. So it has an impact on everything. We have to wear masks. We are worried about our family members. It's about, and there's no sport. For me personally, I'm a big sports fan, so I hate the fact that weekends is nothing for me to watch. But it does affect our lives, industry, and everything around us. So one of the things that we like to use when we do some futures thinking is a futures wheel to say, well, this is the issue. Let's talk about COVID, for instance. What is the first order consequence? This is the direct impact and consequence it has. What is the next level of impact and the level after that? And this is a wonderful exercise to do if you have any issue to deal with, because you can, first of all, identify new opportunities or new avenues of addressing things that you perhaps haven't identified before. But it also allows you that opportunity to think through an issue, various levels further, and not just look at the direct consequences. It's also about creating then a memory of that future, what that future might look like. Because after you've unpacked it several levels further, you can start connecting areas that are connected and have the same consequences. And how could you possibly, from a systems perspective, address something to create systemic changes around? So changes, as we said earlier on, it's not just a continuous change. We have disruptive changes as well. And we're living in an old era, or the present era, if we can call it. Life is pretty much just chugging along and no new dramatic things happening. And that's great, because human beings, as we know, don't quite like it. It could be the era of our parents or grandparents, and then something happens. So to disrupt our lovely, calm current era, and we get a transition. And then we have to redefine about what does it mean? And then we have to think, well, this transition is going to happen. What is the new era going to look like? How is it going to impact me? How does it impact my work, my life, my family? How does it impact what I need from life in order to continue living a fairly satisfied life? And also, I think quite importantly at this stage is, what will it look like for the next generation, for my children and the children that they might have in the future? So change obviously creates generally long-term effects. We know that we can have disruptive change, we can have many transitions. We also know that they generally create major transformations. We know that in life, generally everything we knew up to that point changes. And this is the typical thing about things go along nicely, and then when suddenly something changes, or there's a big boom and things just change. But then, of course, there's no need to despair, because I think the old saying is, there's nothing in life that's certain except death and taxes. I think we can add change to that, because we know that whatever it is we think will happen will probably change. But that doesn't mean we have to frantically pursue all the possibilities that could bring, because some things just won't change. We're all human. Evolution, for instance, takes a long time. We are not going to grow new limbs, new digits for any time soon. These things take a long time. I think that Twitter thumbs, though, might happen quickly. I've heard people say that their thumbs are taking strain from all the tweeting and social media. So that might be a sooner than rather than later change. But anyway, we don't have to overdo change. We need to be aware of it, and we need to be aware of the impacts. Done?
So for part of our conversation with our students are always about the concept of change, the rate of change, the different types of change. And then we go into a little bit more detail about the inbound change, the change that happens to us. And in a way, and some of you might have encountered this in another field, but as far as we know, this is the one thing that distinguishes futures thinking from a lot of other disciplines, is that we never only talk about one future. There is not only one future, there are many futures. So we talk about the cone of possibility, this cone where we have a past, and actually the past is not just one single line. There's different versions of the past that feed into our present. But then when we look at the future, I know one of the foremost futurists of our time, Stuart Candy, he said, if you actually think about it, the possibilities that exist in the future are more than anything that has happened during the course of history so far. And it's almost a scary thought, if you ask me, but he's right, because the future is a blank slate. The potential and the possibilities of what can happen is actually limitless. But when we think about these alternatives, there's one specific future that we probably are all familiar with. It's called the expected future. That is the future that people talk about. That's the future that Bowen, you spoke earlier about trends. That is the expected future is pretty much the future that people expect if they only look at trends. But not all trends last forever. I was actually reading today, they've now determined the height of trees, that it is physically impossible for a tree, due to gravity, etc., to be taller than 128 meters. Now, so even though you could say there's a trend, the tree is growing, at some point the tree has to stop growing, and that's the same with trends. And although this expected future is where we think we're heading, the chances are it's actually not where we're heading. But the fun with futures thinking is that we have multiple possible alternative futures. And when we think about the future, we ask ourselves, okay, but what if something else should happen? And the futures wheel is a wonderful tool for that, but it also we use scenarios to think through these alternative futures as well. And we build sets of plausible futures for unexpected things that could happen. And that these alternatives are as a result of events and issues. I was also listening to another futurist today called Graham Codrington, and he was saying that about 10 years ago, they did 4 scenarios, and they wrote a book about it. And one was a big nuclear standoff. There was some cyber attack. And one of the 4 scenarios was a pandemic. And in fact, when they tried to publish the book, the publishers told them, we really like your book, but this pandemic scenario, we're not so sure about that. It seems like the least feasible one of the lot. Well, hindsight is perfect science, isn't it? But the point is, it doesn't actually matter whether those 4 scenarios played out. The point is that by looking at the possibility that those things could happen, that's when you start preparing yourself for the future. Janine, are you going to take us through the sources of change?
Yes, I think this is probably something that most of you are very familiar with in system thinking. It's about the connectedness of the world. We know that nothing can happen within the social sphere without having an impact on the economy, the politics, environment, technology. And in fact, doesn't just happen to you. It happens to your family, your community, your country, your continent, the world. How that these things can be can impact one another quite severely. I mean, if we just look at COVID, which is a social issue, and a health crisis, which has also become an education crisis, it's become an economic crisis. I mean, it's impacted technology hugely. All of a sudden, we were just propelled into like 10 years into the future, whether we were ready or not. So it's all terribly connected. And then if we look at the type of impacts, for instance, we can look at people, the technology, the transformation needed from the resources, or the resources helping us to transform. There's economic goods that need to be produced, that need to be sourced. It creates waste. It's dependent on government relations. And all of these things then happen within a cultural context. And that context differs for everyone. So that leads us to a way of thinking that says, okay, we can have an expected future, which is constant, it's based on trends. It's fairly logic and scientific because we've got some data, we've got some experiments. This is what we believe should happen. So it relies on analysis, extrapolation. This is what we have. So it's pretty much like a budget. This year we add on 10% for a cost increase. But then there are plausible or alternative futures. Those often incorporate discontinuities, it surprises usually. You need a little bit of creativity and imagination to see, well, what could happen? And then, of course, we can introduce scenarios to tell the story, because stories are the things that we remember and we understand. We visualize a situation based on a story. It's a very age-old method of conveying information, and it helps us understand the alternative. So when we're thinking about this as well, another important aspect is of where are the lenses, the biases, and the assumptions that we make. What are we assuming when we make a decision or we think about the future? Are we assuming that things will change? It's good from time to time to say, well, this is what I'm assuming. These are the givens. But what is the source of that? Where does it come from? And can I challenge that? Because perhaps the source of that assumption could be incorrect. And then, of course, we get to the really, really exciting part, I think, of any exercise in futures thinking, and that is outbound change. It's a change that we can create, and this is where we have agency and we have ability to make a change. And of course, when we talk about outbound change, we also talk about preferred futures. Because ultimately, we all have some idea of the type of future that I would like to experience, that you would like to experience. We know what we want to happen. And we can visualize it. You can visualize yourself walking around on the beach if you're planning a beach holiday next year. So those visuals are powerful. And I think it's important to realize at this stage, when we look at the many alternative futures available, in order to have some sort of certainty, we don't have to predict. We know that we can prepare for something. When you're planning a trip, you're not predicting the fact that you're going on a trip. You're planning for it, and you make actual plans, and there's many actions that precede it. And of course, it's going to be based on our values and our preferences. What do I want to happen? Again, they're not just random. And then, of course, any reasonable exercise about thinking about the future needs to come from as many and as diverse sources as possible. There's a lovely saying that says, the weirder the mix, the better the fix. If we can get as many as possible opinions, thoughts, ideas, alternatives in the mix, then we get a far better, well-rounded, and also probably a lot more resilient result than we would have otherwise. So if we include our preferred future into the mix, then we can also say, well, we know we can't have it all. But we also know that if I want a preferred future of my choice, I have to make choices. I create visions or images of it. It's probably based on my aspirations, my sense of agency, my level of empowerment to make those decisions. And probably you're relying on visioning and imagination to create that.
So thanks, Janine. So when we look at, we've spoken about the vision. So what we need for this outbound change, and this is not something that's unique to future studies. This is something that is shared amongst a number of disciplines. Is we need real leadership. But we can all be leaders in our own communities, in our own environments. We need that vision that you formulate with reference to the preferred future. And then things get real. You need to plan for it and you need to take action. One of our other colleagues, Doris Viljoen, always, I love it when we have conversations with her, because she always ends her talks with the question, so what are you going to do next Wednesday? So although we're talking about the future and we're thinking about the future, it's really about what happens next. So lastly, when we talk to students and to teachers about how do you incorporate foresight into your teaching practice, or into your, even in a normal business meeting, there's only 6 questions that really need to be answered. Is what's happening today? So that let's just be all on the same page. What happened to make it this way? So we look at the past. Then we ask the question, what are the trends? What do we expect to happen? Because another phrase that they use sometimes for the expected future is the used future. That's sort of the one that everyone assumes. And then the magic happens when you start asking, but what might happen instead? And the first question, what do we want to happen? And lastly, the challenge is, what are you going to do about it? So in summary, when we look at the future studies field, we have to consider inbound change. That's the anticipation part. That is the looking at the horizon. And in this case, futures thinking is actually more long-term than forecasting. I mean, forecasting is a valid discipline on its own, but it's about changing the whole system. It's recognizing uncertainty and describing the future using multiple scenarios. And then outbound change is all about our influence. And that, again, is longer term than just plain strategic planning. It's more ambitious. It recognizes complexity. So as you can also see, since you guys are involved with systems innovation and complexity thinking, that is definitely one of the foundational elements of futures thinking. But futures thinking then goes further in a number of other ways. So sorry, Janine.
Sorry, to wrap it up then, is that if we talk about futures thinking, it's about being aware of what's going on, being aware that things change, and just as an interest's sake, change always happens in a certain direction. Just follow it and see where it's planning on going, where it looks like it might land. The other good suggestion is to look out the window to see what's going on. There's a lovely analogy about someone being a lookout on a ship, for instance. They're always on the lookout for something that they're not aware of. So even if someone says, you know, the road's clear, you can go, you can turn left or right, just look out the window as well. And then challenge your assumptions. So what is making you or leading you to the current thinking and the decisions that you're making? Your assumptions might be incorrect, or they might be based on incorrect information, and then you're starting from the wrong space. I think contingency. If we think of military and police, they have a wonderful way. They're always looking to see what might happen, what the situation presents them with, what could go wrong, how could they possibly react differently. And then just embrace the fact that life is uncertain. It's always going to be uncertain. You just don't know which way the uncertainty will go. And then be optimistic and know that you have the ability to influence the future. You don't have to take whatever you're given. You can actually make happen what you want, or something close to that. And then to set a vision and pursue that vision relentlessly through life. Those are value-based decisions and visions. And if you're always seeking something of a specific value, you're probably going to be, you'll end up with that, and something that has the same value for you. And that's pretty much us. So
yeah, that
would be great.
I just want to quickly, this is our advertisement break. We've put the Teach the Future website address there. We are a South African-based organization, and we are a non-profit, and we work with learners, especially learners in our townships, who don't have agency. They don't believe that they can make a difference to their own future, and feel like the future should just happen to them. So we do workshops with them, 1 day, 2 day, and 3 day workshops. where we take them through a lot of the principles that we've discussed today. And if you would like to support us, please go and have a look. The details are all on our website. Thanks very much, Bowen and Quibus.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks, Zanne. Thanks, Janine, for that. Yeah, very informative talk. And first of all, we did have a question as well. will we receive a copy of the slides at the end?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Is that okay? Yeah, just had a question, so I thought I'd. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, in that case, I can post it maybe in the YouTube comments if it's a link, or share that out. Thank you for that. And you know, one thing, just kind of reflecting a bit on one of the things you mentioned at the start, it kind of got me to realize that my own view, I guess, of kind of the future when I was looking at it, because often it is kind of, you know, a perspective, and mine was quite like, you know, is it random? Is it history repeating itself? And I think in some ways, you know, it would really go from back and forth, and I was never really sure how to look at it. But I really like how, you know, by introducing this concept, it's like, actually, you know, of course we can't know exactly what's going to happen. It's not a crystal ball, but if we, you know, there is a lot of thinking, a lot of kind of, you know, practice around how can we think about it better, maybe, and plan better, and actually try to be aware of the things that don't come day to day, that are not always obvious. That doesn't mean that we should just be kind of, you know, blind to them. And so, yeah, I found that personally very interesting. And Cobus, feel free to share any thoughts or any comments on that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Zanne and Janine. That was really informative. And I think one of the things that was striking to me from the Association of Professional Futurists was the fact that there's such a diverse crowd. Yeah. And I think it's quite essential in future studies as well. One of the well-known African futurists, Geshe, as you probably know as well, said in a previous webinar that whatever we do in terms of future thinking, we bring our own views, our own lenses, our own biases, and therefore it's really fundamental that we have diversity when it comes to futures thinking, and especially future studies, whatever, you know, sort of approach we take. And I think from my point of view, so I'm a partner with systems innovation in terms of urban complexity, coming in from an urban systems angle. And I think one of the subjects I was looking at lately was horizon scanning, especially in terms of future studies, and especially urban futures. Mm-hmm. And I was reading a book a while back about called Urban Planet by Alberti and Gonzalez, and where they actually define urban systems or cities as major drivers of global change. Yeah. And my question was, if we apply horizon scanning, you know, what are the signals, the weak signals we can see? So for those who are new to future studies, weak signals are effectively what signs can we see in the present, small signs of a future that's potentially coming our way, and what are the emergent properties in urban systems we can identify in the present in order to plan for the future. If we look at our current situation where we at with COVID, and if you think about it in terms of complex adaptive systems, you have adaptive cycles, and I think we're currently in a massive phase transition where there's a potential for things like leverage points, you know, to promote and present opportunity for transformative planning, you know, and urban design. And I think the question, I mean, everyone's talking about home working, you know, and have we reached a tipping point in terms of home working? So what does that mean for the urban core? What does that mean for the central business district? Does it mean that on a more global scale, it'll be more decentralized? What's the effect it'll have on commerce, for instance? You know, so these leverage points are effectively small shifts in something that creates a change for everything else. I'm thinking in terms of Donella Meadows' leverage points.
Yeah,
and
to intervene in a system.
Absolutely, absolutely. And And I think also another subject that's quite intriguing that was just mentioned now was visioning as well, the concept of visioning, and thinking what is the kind of future that we aspire to have, and what can we do in the present to enable that future.
So you've touched on so many things, and this is why it's so difficult to discuss it, but we haven't even talked about something like empathy, right? And I'm not just talking about empathy with people to each other, but also about people with nature and how we extend that. I don't envy an urban planner's position right now, because I think I wouldn't have the first thing to think about how this is going to go. Urbanization around the world is a mega trend. It's been identified by so many organizations. And yes, we were expecting, how many billions of people to be in cities in a few years' time. And then COVID happens. And all of a sudden, we have this wonderful, really valuable commercial real estate standing empty. And now what do we do with it? And all of a sudden, there's this massive pressure on the technology infrastructure, because everyone's working from home. People are literally buying up equipment from all the computer stores to equip their home offices. So there's more pressure on resources to create and build this infrastructure and computer and technology components. On an economic level, people are losing jobs. How does that impact them? Is it cheaper? Can you cut a whole lot of costs by keeping people at home and not using an office and saving on rental? And then there's this political pressure, and I don't know what's happening in the UK, but people go through cycles. I mean, you can even equate people's responses to the crisis in terms of the whole grief cycle process, where people are first in denial and they go through stages of anger and then they accept it. But it's a process. People have lost loved ones, they've lost co-workers. So all of these things are playing in. How this will affect urbanization, I don't know. I think that's something you would probably need. There will be so much input we require to understand where it's going. I think it will have an impact. Does this mean we have urbanization on a smaller scale in a number of areas rather than one big urban center? That's possible. Are we finally going to be able to use the empty spaces and office buildings as urban farms? That will be wonderful. Because there's, again, with the whole COVID pandemic, there was a drive for local produce, locally produced goods. We've realized we can't depend on other countries to import goods. We can't export. So does the world become greener accidentally because of COVID? That could also be a consequence. So yes, I don't know is to answer your question. You're the expert in that, and I think it's probably, one can probably start seeing these things happening, whether they'll be long term, whether they will stick, and ultimately how much is the economy going to dictate whether urbanization comes to an early halt and we have these decentralized urban spaces, as it were. I don't know.
I'm not sure whether there's another question, because I don't want to deny anyone a question, but I just want to actually put a challenge forward. Kobus, you've spoken about urban planning, and Janine has also spoken about some of the impacts that we're already seeing with COVID. My challenge to anyone that is willing to take it up is there are other disruptions coming our way. Climate change is not necessarily, it's now a climate emergency. We know the ice caps are melting. We actually don't know the extent of what's happening. We also know that there's geopolitical tension between China and the United States. And we know that the world is a lot more connected than it's ever been. We've seen the impact of that through COVID. And cyber, I mean, there was Garmin this week, was it last week, completely paralyzed by a cyber attack. So my challenge is not to think about what is happening tomorrow, but to explore possible futures with those kinds of disruptions, climate emergency, geopolitical tension, cyber attacks, and say to yourself, well, what if those things happen? How will I respond? Because then you are building a memory of the future.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think that's one of the foundations really of concepts like geodesign,
Yeah.
where people from different disciplines come together, professionals, and really plan different scenarios. So it's not your bog standard trend analysis, and therefore we plan in a certain way. It's really to come together and say, what are the scenarios that can play out and that can emerge from this, and how can we apply that? And I think that's why it's really essential for me that complexity is understood in urban planning and design. I mean, there's no better time than now, looking at COVID, to really understand the effect of complexity and the effect on complex interconnected systems. I mean, we can look at global hyperconnectivity. There was a flu-like symptom in Wuhan, and now how many million people are affected globally in 6 months, 7 months? So it really opened our eyes to this concept of hyperconnectivity and interconnectedness globally, I think.
And the pandemics, I think, the scientists are saying that it's not the first and last pandemic of our generation even. I mean, with climate change, there's also the possibility of further pandemics. We've also had a scientist this week, an article saying that as people, with urbanization again, as people are coming into more and more contact with animals, with an economic pressure, trying to find cheap protein sources as well, they're going to turn to more and more unconventional sources, and that might increase the possibilities of future pandemics. So one of the other challenges, as I'm sure you're very aware, is for people to take this planning and how does it impact us in the future seriously, because normally they, oh, well, it's over now, so we go back to normal. But it can't be, because you might encounter something like that again. So in terms of urban planning, how do we cater for future healthcare needs within an urban environment or multiple urban pockets in our societies? Are we going to just get out of this crisis and then everything stays as it is? Or are we going to start making plans for possible health scares or pandemics because of climate change or because of all these other factors? There generally seems to be almost a sense of denial with people that, oh, well, it's probably not going to happen again. We don't like to think of change occurring on a more regular basis. It's also almost, and the very interesting thing is that we as human beings are always looking to the future. This is our nature. I mean, the old ancient cavemen stopped being nomadic when they could plant crops and stay in one place. But we planted crops and we knew that we were going to harvest in a few months' time. So it's our nature to look at the future, but we don't look too long in advance because it scares us a little bit. It's too uncertain. And the challenge is with governments, businesses, is for them to realize that uncertainty will be there and will continue to be there. And it's long term. And how do we plan for that long-term uncertainty? And take that into consideration when we plan and strategically for the next 10, 15, 20 years.
So, Bowen, do you have any questions for us?
Yes, I was just about to say, definitely with, we're talking about COVID and the effect on urbanization is a huge topic. And I guess one question that came to mind for me, and it's a question that came from the audience as well, is, we can see that this can be a very powerful kind of approach for whether it's organizations or different types of organizations working with uncertainty. Do you have any kind of examples or case studies to share of, where people have used these approaches, how they kind of went about it, and what was the outcome of that?
Absolutely, yes. So one of the other foremost futurists around the world is called Suhail Inyatullah, and he's quite renowned for a methodology called CLA, causal analysis, and he's been doing a lot of interesting things with law enforcement. It's something, if you want to, you can Google it. But so reimagining police forces, and I mean, especially in light of what's happening in the United States, that's the kind of conversations we are supposed to be having. So instead of saying the metaphor for policing should be that we are catching criminals and we are putting them in jail, why don't we change the metaphor? The metaphor for crime is a monster. So, and therefore we need to catch criminals and put them in jail. What if we change the metaphor to say, what if crime is like a virus and the solution for crime is not putting people in jail, but more education and eliminating poverty? So, so that's a good example on a global scale of someone that's doing an interesting work. Janine, I don't know whether you've got an example that you would like to share.
Yeah, so we've done several examples about unpacking consequences, etc. We've done quite a bit of work with students on the COVID pandemic and how that affects them. Literally even drilling down to things like your parent has lost their job and there's no further funding for you to continue during this period. There's also, I was in a call a couple of weeks ago with UNESCO on the future of education. They're launching a campaign fairly soon about Save Our Future. And what COVID has done to the education system around the world, there is something like 500,000 learners around the world who are at home but also have no access to any kind of technology to continue their schooling. There's also a concern, for instance, that about 20% or so of those won't ever go back to school after this pandemic. So there's a lot of work that needs to go into that in terms of how do we get back on track. There's also a lot of almost ground lost in terms of educating girls, progress that's been made in terms of gender rights that have been undone. There's been global increase in gender-based violence and so forth during the COVID, undone a lot of almost 20 years worth of progress. So in terms of that, just during this last year, I think there are quite a few examples, and one can start unpacking that on the systems level and also to see where you could possibly intervene. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Well, I just wanted to add something which I think might be interesting is one country that's actually using futures thinking more than anyone else is Finland. They've got a minister of the future. So it's not
Wales.
Yes.
And Wales.
And Wales, yes. So it's definitely something that is and that's gaining ground, and Finland is also incorporating futures thinking into their education curriculum because they realize it's important for their learners. And of course that's the vision of our movement of Teach the Future, because we really want to get it in every school, in every classroom across the world, but small steps.
Yeah, also, that's fascinating. Yeah, sorry, Janine.
In Holland, I'm also part of Teach the Future, a lady by the name of Erica Ball, where they do workshops with youngsters, young ones, say 8, 9, 10, and up to about 13, where they every year define what their vision is of their ideal city. And at the end of those few days workshop, they actually present their plan and vision to the mayor. And they say, this is what we as the future generation want our city to look like. So you need to start planning now to make that a reality for us. And it's become a tradition. And so they update that vision every year. And I think it's been quite a successful application of that. And it's taken seriously.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. And I think, if we have any links or kind of articles to share, it'd be great to, maybe we could share a few in the YouTube comments so people can see those as well. Thank you for that. So this is an interesting question from the audience. How is expertise, imagine this is in a certain domain, or let's say you're an expert in this domain that you're working on. How is expertise a benefit and or a barrier to this practice of futures thinking?
Mm-hmm. So expertise in any specific field or just in general?
I think the question was just in general. Yeah, maybe we can answer it that way.
I think that, sorry, Janine. I think, you know what, we need experts. We need lots of experts in all sorts of different fields. The one thing that I would recommend for anyone that wants to practice futures thinking is to not do it on their own. Because we are all experts in something, but get those alternative opinions. That slide that Janine spoke about, the weirder the mix, the better the fix. So because in my experience, future studies and futures thinking recognizes that people are experts and that they have certain knowledge, but don't let that confine you by not be open to other opinions. And the other thing that's sort of a mantra that people are, it's easier for us to recognize disruption in other industries than it is for us to recognize disruptions in our own industry. So just be aware that that's a bias that comes with being an expert, that you believe that what you've been taught and how it should happen is how it should be. For example, if that's why disruptions that we've seen in the like Uber, for example, how they disrupted transport. They were a technology company because they didn't come with all the baggage that came with traditional transport companies. And you don't have to let the baggage hold you back, just as long as you're open for other opinions. But expertise are still incredibly valuable.
Yeah, thanks, Zanne.
Leaving the ego at the door, if you're willing to entertain the fact that someone else might have an opinion that could be of value and who's not necessarily the same type of expert as yourself.
Yeah, totally. And you know, it brings me back to the slide, as you say, the having diversity leads to better, more sustainable solutions. So definitely. And maybe this time for one last question. So this one is, how is future studies different than change management or strategic management?
So it's a good question. And that's in terms of change management, it's actually something that we did as a whole module as part of our original studies in futures. Because once you've decided that you need to take some action steps, you've perhaps gone through an exercise, you've done some research, you've come up with some scenarios on what your company's future might look like, you then have to start planning for that preferred or multiple different futures, right? You don't know what's going to happen. You then also need to institute some sort of change management plan to institute those action steps, because what you are proposing is something different to what people are expecting. It's something different to what you have been planning the last few years. And that's, I think, what makes it quite difficult for companies and individuals to understand and embrace any form of uncertainty. You've spent a lot of time developing a strategy. It's probably been several conferences, employee programs put together to say, this is where the company is going. But now we need to change that. And with that comes resistance. So, and a lot of that we know is a cultural resistance. So yes, change management is part of that. And you will have to institute some form, and it doesn't matter which process you use, if it's Prosky, Agile, what type of change management model you use, but you are going to have to address it. It is generally also a good idea if you want to institute these changes, that you share the thinking with your employees and with people so that they understand. Often what happens is people go through the process of planning, maybe doing some foresight work, coming up with scenarios, but the people who finally hear the scenarios weren't part of that original thinking. So they don't understand where it's coming from. They don't have that context. So it's important, I think, to involve as many of the employees and people as possible. So yes, it is a little bit different from, I see change management as the action part, or part of the action part of getting it done.
Thank you.
I also just wanted to maybe end on one of my favorite quotes. There's another famous futurist called Jim Data. He sits in Hawaii. It sounds like a wonderful place to be thinking about the future. And Jim Data always says any thought about the future should be a little bit ridiculous, because and I think that's what for me distinguishes futures thinking from a lot of other disciplines, is that we allow for imagination, we allow for creativity, because that creativity is what ultimately is going to drive an interesting and the future that we want.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for that. And I guess just before we wrap up, Cobus, did you have anything you wanted to add or ask as a final wrap up?
Yeah, I just want to thank Janine and Zanne again for joining us today. Fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. Just a final question for me. We were talking about examples of practicing future studies and futures literacy. And I think Zanne was talking about policing, what Sahel was talking about, the causal layered analysis. And there's a fantastic TED talk about it as well. So I think that's something we can post on YouTube for everyone to view.
Yeah.
And in terms of education that Janine mentioned, there's a book by one of our fellow APF members, Brian Alexander. I think it's called Academia Next, and it's basically the transformation in academia in higher education, or futures in higher education rather, going forward. So I think that's also a link we can share with everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I actually have it on my bookshelf right behind me.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, thank you so much. Just like to echo that as well. And I know that you shared a link to your website earlier. Is that the best way for people to kind of stay on top of what your organization are doing, or is there anything else you would kind of suggest?
Well, we're also on LinkedIn and Facebook. So LinkedIn is probably the easiest. It's Teach the Future South Africa. So we can share that link as well.
Okay, fantastic. And Janine, sorry.
No, that's fine. I just maybe not sure if we mentioned is that we're not just doing this in isolation. The Teach the Future is in fact a global movement, global organization, and we have people doing this exact same type of thing that we are doing in about 13 countries: Europe, South America, Mexico, Asia, etc. And this has all come about because we've realized that it is not good enough for us to go through life without looking to how we can improve our own futures, and that we have the skills, the power to actually make that happen.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful call to action and a way to wrap up. But yeah, thank you everyone, and thanks for all of you who joined as well. Have a great day.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Bye everyone. Okay, great.